Hello, friends. Host Eric here. Host Talking with Famous People. I've just watched the first 12 minutes or so of 13 minutes of Science Can Answer Moral Questions, a Sam Harris TED Talk. And I want to respond to what I've heard so far. I've flowed it, which is to say, I've written down all of the arguments that he's made on either side of this envelope. And I have some initial takeaways from it. So, his basic position here is that the distinction between facts and values is illusory. That actually we do have ways in which we can think objectively about morality. Now, as a basic position, let me just say I agree with this entirely, that there are objective ways to think about morality. However, I think that what this TED Talk reveals is what happens when you don't start with the initial reality that we have to draw a distinction between positive and negative moralities. What one ought not do can be determined objectively. What one ought to do cannot. So that's something that, if you don't begin with that distinction, you're not really talking meaningfully about morality at all, frankly, because the distinction is critical. So he says, I guess I'll start on this side. Is this where it started? This is the other side. Yeah. He says that all morality boils down to a range of conscious experiences, and it's reducible to exchanges. Namely, if I do this, what will the impact be to conscious experience? He points out that we don't have compassion for rocks, but we do potentially for ants and a lot more for primates, and that we link this compassion to complexity of consciousness, or complexity of possible experience. He points out correctly that we know there's a continuum along lines from failed state to free society, free and functioning free society, and that some states of being are better than others, that these things are factual, that we're insane to engage in moral relativism when something's obviously morally wrong. I agree with him completely. However, here's an area where I start to disagree a little bit. He says, the reason this is determinable by science is because culture, belief, ideology, thinking, metacognition change the brain, and neuroscience should be able to provide us information about moral truth. Neuroscience can't provide us any information about moral truths. I mean, it can provide us information about, like, how and why and where in the brain moral thinking occurs, potentially. It can be descriptive in that fashion, but it can't provide us any normative guidance. And Sam Harris says he doesn't think we'll ever be able to consult a supercomputer to tell us whether we should have a second child, or whether we should bomb Iran, or whether we should whatever. But again, I point out that questions of positive morality are a lot more challenging to answer than questions of negative morality here. So he does say values reduced to facts. Well, that's a kind of a squirrely thing to say. Values don't reduce to facts. Facts, you can't have values without facts. But here also a distinction needs to be made between the particular instance and the universalist representation. We use language to talk about instances, but usually we're talking about examples, general instances, and not specific instances. Is it good to give money to the poor is a question nobody can answer. Is it good for me right now to give money to this guy is a question that potentially could be answered by you and that guy, maybe. Should I stab this guy is a question that's very easy to answer. And that's a significant distinction to be made. It says that there might be states that people rarely access that might appropriately be called spiritual or whatever. And he says additionally, there might be states that we can't access, but others can. So we have to acknowledge that the experiences of human conscious may include experiences that we designate as divine or special in some regard, and that's okay. It doesn't run afoul of any reasonable person's assessment of the things he's presenting, which is true. And he points out that if we can change the way we talk about morality, that we could improve things. And he's basically attacking moral relativism here with good cause, obviously. He talks about corporal punishment in 27 states in the United States where it is legal for teachers in classrooms to hit children, and argues that it's expressly religious in its justifications. Well, it may be expressly religious in its justifications, but it's not exclusively religious in its justifications. And while I might agree with you entirely that it's appalling. I mean, I think it's appalling that children are the only people we can hit. Like, you can't hit anybody else. Why would you be able to hit your own children? And that's where the negative and positive distinction makes things really clear. It's like, the reason it's wrong for you to hit the child is not because it's a little child. It's not because it hurts the child. It's because it violates the child's rights. And we can deduce rights from by beginning with this question: do I own my body? Does somebody else own my body? Or is my body unowned? Or something else, if you have some sort of other answer. If the answer is you own your own body, then we can deduce rights from that reality. Do you favor slavery? If you do, then not everybody owns their own body, potentially. And that's one position you can take, I guess. If you don't favor slavery, then you favor everybody owning their own body. You could try to say that bodies are unowned or unownable, except by any definition of ownership, I have met this criterion when it comes to my own body. One good definition of ownership is the exclusive right to destroy, or the exclusive right to legitimately destroy. So I could, in theory, kill myself. Not that I would ever do such thing, but and people might condemn me for it, but it would at that point be impossible to punish me for it. And in general, as a society, we think it would be insane to attempt to punish people for harming themselves, because punishment is a form of harm that we use to correct bad behavior. So we normally want to reserve it for people who harm others, because after all, they're violating somebody else's rights. Whereas when you harm yourself, you're not violating anybody's rights. You have ownership over your body, and if you choose to do bad things to it, well, it's your body. So the thing is, it's important to say, now here's where I don't like his arguments very much, is this continuum thing. So he's basically saying that, look, we can't really truly understand human well-being precisely. Like we can't have a single definition of well-being. And he shows a slide where it's got a very bumpy landscape, and he says, this is like human experience. There's peaks and valleys all over the place. There's lots of different ways to attain the good, and lots of different ways to attain the bad. And just because we don't have consensus on what constitutes well-being doesn't mean we can't draw conclusions about it nevertheless. For example, he says as an analogy, look at physical health. a long time ago. Maybe human lifespan was 30 years. Now it's 80. Maybe if we mess with the genome, eventually, if you can't run a marathon at age 200, you're considered disabled. That's what he said. Okay, well, the problem with this analogy is you've established what the criterion for well-being is in that in your analogy. So the analogy is, well, we don't need to know precisely what well-being is because it's a continuum. Just like we don't need to precisely know what physical well-being is because it's a continuum. But you define well-being as a function of lifespan and of capacity to do physical action in your analogy. And there are similar analogous things for human well-being that we can point to and define meaningfully when addressing moral questions. For example, if you want to set things down as a principle to which people can reliably expect themselves to adhere to without running afoul of a lot of particularist exceptions, then coercion, aggression is bad. Unjustified use of force. And if we want to talk about well-being, we know that whenever there's an unjustified use of force, well-being suffers. In other words, well-being is inverse to violence, but not necessarily inverse to force. It's a tricky question. I'm not denying that. But I think that just simply saying, well, I may not be able to find pornography, but I know it when I see it, is not an adequate parsing of it. Because, of course, if you're going to say there is an absolute answer, but we can't find a criterion on which to determine the moral question, then you're just saying it's okay to be arbitrary. If you don't have a framework through which these things are determined, then you simply shift frameworks every time you determine the question, which means there's no real criterion. It's just arbitrary. Well, in this circumstance, let's ignore the principles, let's ignore the constraints, and justify the means with the ends, because I don't have any principled constraint. There's no limiting principle. So it's pretty critical that we don't just mush shit out like this and say, well, because we know. But you're not doing any intellectual work there, Sam Harris. Alright, so he says there's no reason why moral principles need to be exception-free. And then he gives another bad analogy. He says, well, in chess, there's a general rule that you shouldn't lose your queen. But it's not universal. Sometimes it's the best thing you can do. And sometimes that's the thing you have to do to win the game. Okay, but again, the reason the analogy is bad is a failure to distinguish between positive and moral and negative moral or actions. It may be true that protect your queen is a general rule, but it's also true that if you don't protect your king, you lose. So it's like, should I prevent my king from getting killed is a universal answer. The answer is always yes. Should I prevent my king from getting killed? There's never an answer that's no. Should I move my king away from this attack, that's going to get me? I'm in check. Should I move out of check? The answer is never no. So in your analogous situation, You're talking about chess being objective, quote unquote, being a closed system, is what you mean. You don't mean it's objective. You mean it's a closed system. So even and in that closed system, he's trying to say, well, even in this closed system, we can't have a firm rule. We just have heuristics. But that's not true. We can have firm negative rules. We can't have firm positive rules. We can't have a rule that says you should always move your queen over here, or you should always move your king over here. But we can have a negative rule that says, in this instance, if I don't prevent my king from getting killed, then I lose. That's a universal. Similarly, with morality, you may be able to argue that it's a good idea to be altruistic. It's a good idea to give money to the poor or whatever. But you shouldn't need to argue that it's bad to steal and kill and violate people's rights. Now, where Homie and I really start to join hands and sing Kumbaya is in his absolutely right on the money critique of cultural relativism and the examples that he gives of Islam. Is it morally acceptable to force women to wear the hijab? And he points out that lots of people, probably in that audience and in America, choose to take a tolerance approach to this and say, look, their culture is different. Who are we to tell them that this is wrong or right or whatever? Well, we are human beings, and we know that it's not okay to force women to do shit like that. It's not okay to murder your daughter because she got raped in an honor killing, as he also indicates Muslim communities tend to do. Both of those are not okay for the same reason. They're rights violating. Now, as you know, it's like you might say it's if I were a Muslim man and I said it's more moral for a woman to wear a hijab, then I'm making a positive moral claim, and it's necessarily subjective because all positive moral claims are. And if I accept that it's subjective positive moral claim, then great, no problem. I'm simply making a positive moral claim. Now, if I then, instead of saying just that women should wear it, that it's morally advantageous for them to do so, I instead take the different approach and say women should be subjected to coercion should be subjected to punishment if they don't wear it, or coercion if they try not to or something. That's a whole different question. That's a separate moral question, and the answer is absolutely not. So you can advocate whatever crazy nonsense you want, but you can't force people to do shit that violates their rights. You can force people in some contexts to do some things, like, for example, if the police have a good reason to believe I've committed a crime and violated somebody else's rights, then they may detain me, and they may use threats of violence to do so. And if I am found guilty of that crime, then I may forfeit some of my rights and have to go to jail for a while. This is a just and normal and understandable situation because it's responsive to a rights violation. If it's not responsive to a rights violation, then it is itself a rights violation. So when the state threatens to jail people for drug violations, it is making an ownership claim over their bodies, as Kinsella says. That's almost an exact quote from this author Kinsella, who writes this great rights article. I'll share the badass rights article document at the end of this. Anyway, Sam Harris I'm pretty impressed with in general across the board. He's a smart guy, and what he's saying there about cultural relativism especially is important. But I just again want to point out that the reason that talk is so unsatisfyingly non-determinate is because he fails to make this distinction. The end.